curbside service right now during our stay-at-home orders. If you order your books online, you can come pick those up on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday from 10 to 2, and on Wednesday from 2 to 6. So we've got a few mornings there and an evening you can come pick up books curbside. And of course, the safest option right now, contact-free, direct shipping to your home or to your loved one via our website. And we just so happen to have free shipping this week, and we'll probably be extending that through the holiday season. So if you spend $40, you get free shipping. It's free ship 40 is the coupon code. That's all right there on our homepage. Our homepage is Bookworks without the O's. So it's a lot of consonants here. It's bkwrks.com. I'm going to put that link into the chat here soon, along with the link to pick up Pery Wilkes' new book, Under the Torn Paper Mountains. We were just chatting about this before we started. I'm curious to hear more about the book he calls a novelization of true events. So we shall learn more. Pery Wilkes is here with us, along with his partner, Carolyn Kinsman. She designed the book for him. They are remoting in from Sonora, Mexico, where they are luckily retired after spending a lot of time in Albuquerque and the Rio Grande River Valley. As many of you probably know Pery, and I know lots of you, so thank you so much, friends, for joining us. Pery holds a BA in architecture from the University of New Mexico. He specialized in passive solar design and energy efficiency, something increasingly important in our world. He has lived throughout New Mexico and worked in New Mexico in the Southwest, and was on the board of the New Mexico Solar Energy Association, as well as past president of the Downtown Neighborhood Association. We've worked with them. They have a great guide of downtown Albuquerque. Pery and his wife have done tons of traveling around the world. I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that. You can read about those dispatches from his blog. I will put the link into the chat. Like I said, they're coming to us from Sonora, Mexico. Pery and Carolyn, welcome. How are you all doing? Thanks so much for celebrating Small Business Saturday with us.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate you doing this. This is our kickoff for the book, you might say. This is the first reading we've ever done for this book. So, so I thank you for doing that. Thanks to Bookworks. Remember, you can get what you need there book-wise at Bookworks. And we're looking forward to the next, maybe 6 months or a year from now when we get back to one of the wonderful, normal things we used to do often in Albuquerque that we took so much for granted, which is go out to the beautiful North Valley to Bookworks, pick up a book, go next door and have some breakfast at Flying Star. And it's just one of those great events. It's one of the great events of an Albuquerque experience. Anyway, thanks everybody for being here today. This is a big event, as I mentioned. Here we are gathered around the campfire, which is how we have to do it these days. We're still, even this way, we're still a part of the great conversation. It was the title of a book by Robert W. Hutchings. We're carrying on our part with this conversation from Plato and Aristotle through Kepler, Copernicus, Darwin, everything. You're all adding something to it by everything you do. As my grandfather once said, every little thing we all do changes the whole world. And another good buddy of mine, though, not to get overblown about all this, he said, "Well, look, if you can't be brilliant, at least try to be useful." I always thought that was good advice. So I try to live with that. Anyway, this is the book. You may be aware of it. Carolyn did this gorgeous cover, and the Torn Paper Mountains. There's an allusion to what that's about inside the book, and it's a passage down the Rio Grande Valley through the geology, the geography, the comments on all of this and the history. It's a nexus. It's a sacred place to me, the Rio Grande Valley. I lived there for 50 years and really absorbed a lot of the history of the place. And it's a pretty remarkable place. So we're heading down the Rio Grande Valley in a hippie van, basically, and in the 70s, early 70s. Me and some good friends, a couple of good friends, a couple I knew, I still know. They're quite good people, good friends. And of course, we pull out, my buddy there called Mark in the book pulls out a joint. We getting mellow, and we head down through redneck country in a hippie van. A good plan, right? Anyway, we end up going down the river with all these flashbacks, as I mentioned, back to my days as a young person joining the Marines because I didn't know better. And the things that there are some adventures in there about all jumping out of aircraft and all swimming in the shark infested waters and other things like that, that I probably wouldn't think of doing today, but it seemed to be natural at the time. I mean, who's going to pay you to jump out of aircraft? I got to do it for free. So without having to pay anything. So then we head down the river, and I'm remembering other events that have occurred, including prospecting in southern Arizona in the middle of the summer, another bad plan. But I had a lot of adventures down there, and then hitchhiked back to the Albuquerque and met some interesting characters along the way. And then I later get involved with the Poor People's Campaign and hitchhiking back to Washington, D.C. More adventures and spending some time there in the encampment. That was a remarkable event. And it's an emotional passage and a physical passage down the valley. Let me go ahead and get started with the reading here. We're heading south. Okay, this is how it starts. The news hit me hard, much harder than I ever could have imagined. I felt as if the life had been suddenly forced out of me as I slumped heavily into an old chair with the phone still pressed to my ear. It was Karen on the other end, and she was calling to tell me that Annie was dead. Early details were sketchy, as they always are when something like this happens. Annie had fallen and hit her head, or something like that. She had died in the car on the way to the closest hospital. Rob, her sometime live-in boyfriend, by that time had found her by the stairs in their remote cabin late in the afternoon when he returned from work. The police were questioning Rob before they released any more information, because parts of it just didn't add up. Rob and Annie had fought often. Karen and I spoke for a few minutes more, and then I thanked her and hung up the phone. Then there was nothing more to say. And whatever relationship Annie and I once had long ago was over, and in a way, I was now finally and tragically free. I stared through a window at a small tree swaying in a stiff spring wind, its naked branches bearing the rich and promising buds of another summer, a summer that Annie would not be part of. I thought again of those days when we were younger, and of Annie as I wanted to remember her. We were young then, in a time when it seemed that youth was its own reward and there was no meaningful consequence to it all. Yet there was so much that seemed to be of tremendous importance among the events of those days. Much of it wonderful, much of it merely confusing, all of it part of a generational movement that swept over us and across the entire country and that carried us along with it. And it changed each of us in ways we could not even imagine. We embraced it, astounded by ourselves in a place that we somehow felt was very near the center of it all, whatever it was. I suddenly realized I had been staring for some time at a dirty plastered wall just beyond the edge of my old wooden kitchen table. My right hand was still wrapped around the cold remains of a cup of coffee. An open box of cereal sat beside a clean and empty bowl. A large spoon with a bent handle lay beside the bowl on the chipped white painted wooden table. I had been spending a lot of time lately just staring at one wall or another in this small adobe house that occupied one bend of a winding dirt road in the Rio Grande Valley. I usually began each morning staring at this particular wall, staring at it, but not seeing it, really. I poured some cereal into the bowl and finished breakfast And then I sat for a few more minutes and looked out my dirty kitchen window with another cup of coffee, and I waited. A pair of finches scratched in the dirt outside by a pile of salvaged construction materials. The sun was already starting to heat the desert floor and the inside of the kitchen as it streamed across the table and onto my kitchen floor. This day had finally come, and I hoped it would change things in my life, a lot of things that needed changing. I rose from the table and washed the dishes. My bags were packed. It was time to go. Mark pulled off the washboard dirt road and onto my gravel driveway. From inside the cool, thick adobe walls, leaky windows, and sagging front door, I heard the roar of an old VW bus engine, the chatter of tires on gravel, and the raucous, laughing voices of Mark and Linda above it all. Mark's gleeful and obnoxious honking of the horn was totally gratuitous and yet not at all unexpected. I needed them to be here now. I needed to get myself out of what had become a seriously whiny mood, and I needed to stop thinking about Annie. Mark killed the engine and they were out of the bus laughing as they ran across the desolate space that passed for our front yard, and they were through the front door before I could open it. They spilled onto the only reasonable, livable room in my totally adobe that I was still renovating, and almost tripped over the mattress and box spring that were resting on the worn wooden floor. A war surplus army trunk beside the bed served as a nightstand, holding 3 half-read novels and a second-hand gooseneck lamp. A small table and 2 chairs stood along the opposite wall near an old freestanding wood stove. They edged around the mattress and passed most of my belongings stacked in the cardboard boxes toward the kitchen. This place still looks awful, Linda laughed as she glanced around my never-ending construction project and across the floor that hadn't been swept in a while. It didn't deserve more than a quick glance because there wasn't all that much to look at. Do you think you'll ever actually finish moving in? She asked with a skeptical smile and a shake of her head. She stared at another large pile of boxes stacked in one corner. Someday it'll look a lot better than this, I grinned, but without much conviction. I was hoping the pain wasn't real obvious so early in the morning. This renovation project was just the next logical step in the rest of my turbulent life. I hadn't had much time to think things out when Annie and I got divorced, and more than a year ago. At the time, it just seemed I just needed a cheap place to live. The whole thing happened so quickly. I didn't have a clue what I was going to do next. Well, our parting really shouldn't have come as much of a surprise, but it did anyway. These things probably never happen in such a way that you can plan out the next phase of what's left of your life. Mark grabbed my tattered suitcase off the bed while I finished stuffing a few more things to another one. Come on, man, let's go, he laughed. At this rate, it'll be dark before we get to the border. We had about 7 hours driving time ahead of us on our way to Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Actually, it might be more like 8 hours in a fully loaded Volkswagen bus, and maybe longer when you added in a lunch break and some pit stops. I grabbed my jacket and we headed for the bus. It was 7 a.m. The sun had already begun to cook the desert floor, but maybe we'd miss the worst of the afternoon heat if we left now. And we needed to make an early start if I was going to catch one of the afternoon buses to Chihuahua. I had never been south of Juarez before, and I didn't want to miss anything by traveling at night. I wanted to know Mexico instead of remaining just another gringo bystander. Then I want to give you a reading here to kind of give you a little more information about the person Annie, a fictionalized version of various events, relationships, shall we say, at the time. We're still in the bus here. How are you doing back there? Mark's voice sounded like it was echoing inside a large steel drum. I looked up to see him smiling at me in the rear view mirror, his face framed by his curly, reddish tinged beard. Fine, I said, just fine. I was still in a joint-fueled haze surrounded by the clouds burying my thoughts, and I felt insulated from the world. I sincerely hoped Mark was handling the dope better than I was, since he was driving the bus. He looked away and back toward the road. Linda was staring absently into the desert ahead in her own thoughts. The weed was just beginning to lose its mellow forward edge, and I began to ease slowly out of my reverie. I thought of Annie again. Excuse me, let me grab a drink of water here. To me, she was very pretty in a non-glamorous farm girl kind of way, and she was born in Montana, a true young woman of the West. She worked as a waitress at a local barbecue stand while she went to journalism school at the university. I first saw her when I stopped to get lunch one day, and I wanted to get to know her, but I couldn't think of anything to say that would sound unstupid. I smiled and she smiled back. She had a beautiful, friendly smile, and I wanted to get to know the person behind it. I was so unsure of myself, I didn't go back for a couple of weeks. When I finally returned, she surprised me by treating me to a slice of the cook's famous apple pie. I shyly thanked her and paid the rest of the bill before walking across the parking lot to my old Ford pickup truck in a light fall drizzle. As I backed my truck away from the side of the building and pointed it toward the street, I could see Annie leaving as she got off work. She pulled a barrette out of her hair and ran through the rain to cross the street on her way home, her long, curly, brownish blonde hair streamed behind her in the breeze. I pulled up beside her and asked if she wanted a ride so she wouldn't get all wet. She looked aside, briefly thoughtful, and then opened the passenger door and climbed in with a happy laugh. It was an early evening in the fall, and we were warm and dry, and everything was suddenly wonderful as we drove on through glistening and leaf-spattered side streets. I have to say, she told me later that was she'd planned to. She took the barrette out and ran across the street in the rain, thinking that would look interesting. So, and it was. Anyway, Annie shared a small older house with a young married couple named Barbara and Fred. We had hot tea and split a muffin while we talked about school, the recent demonstrations on campus, the latest books we had read. As I was leaving, I asked if she wanted to catch a movie on Thursday night, but she had late classes. Instead, she asked me to stop by after her last class. When I arrived that night, the house was dark and it looked deserted. I thought I had misunderstood something about the time I was supposed to arrive, or maybe I was early, or maybe it was the wrong night. But as I knocked on the door, I noticed a candle flickering in a red glass jar on a table, faintly visible through lace curtains. Annie slowly opened the door, wearing only a simple blue nightgown. She smiled shyly, handed me a glass of wine, and stuck a lighted joint between my lips as she started to unbutton my shirt. Barbara and Fred are in Denver for the rest of the week, she said quietly. And then she put her finger to my lips when I started to reply. So you finally found someone to put up your bullshit, Fred later told Annie. She laughed and she told me about it, I didn't know what he meant at the time, and I let it pass. There are times when it's best not to know everything. I don't want people to know everything about my own past and maybe hold it against me. So I didn't ask Annie about it. So let me get into how I got into the Marines, shall we say. So I'm trying to read various pieces here and there that are indicative of the breadth of the book. I've decided to join the Marines, I told my dad one Saturday morning as I was nearing graduation from high school, so I don't have to take orders from you anymore, and so I can go do what I want. I thought he was going to choke on his coffee as he let out a hoot and leaned forward in his easy chair. He had been quietly reading the morning paper when I entered the room and peered over the top of the editorial section to make my announcement. Wait a minute, he coughed as he tried to regain his composure, and amid all the laughter, while the newspaper crashed into his lap. Let me get this straight. You're going to join the Marines, so you don't have to take orders from me anymore? His mouth was hanging open in disbelief. He was laughing so hard that a tear was rolling down his face. He dabbed his eyes with a handkerchief and peered back at me with an incredulous look. Well, yeah, I said, and looked away at the door. He had me this time. What I had just said was amazingly stupid, and I knew it instantly. But it was the same kind of stupid thing all my buddies were saying to each other and to their own parents at that time in their lives. We knew nothing of bullying sergeants and incompetent lieutenants and the horrible reality of war. We only shared a Saturday morning cartoon fantasy about war and bravery. We weren't smart enough yet to figure out that John Wayne and other phony celluloid heroes had been draft dodgers during the Second World War. That's why they had the time to make cheap propaganda movies in the safety of sunny California instead of going overseas to join the real battle. They'd hung out around Hollywood creating a fantasy world of heroism while other guys went off to fight and die by the thousands in that sort of meat grinder called modern warfare. It was the most venal form of self-promotion directed at the young, the simple, and the naive. And I had fallen for it just as other young guys had long ago. But now that I had made the announcement, it was too late to reconsider. I had already told my buddies I was going off to the Marines. I couldn't back down now without losing face and looking like an idiot. I had to go through it, even though it was beginning to look more and more like a big mistake. What is it about this damn male pride business anyway? Why do we do this to ourselves? Well, I got a chance to jump out of some aircraft and things like that, but they didn't understand. The sergeants really didn't understand when I talked to them about the pure aesthetic joy of it all. I mean, big tough sergeants don't seem to get much, don't understand the word aesthetics, I guess. But what I spend a lot of my weekends doing was in San Diego's beautiful Balboa Park. I found some interesting books at a bookstore on my way there. The anti-war poems of Wilfred Owen from the First World War, and also Siegfried Sassoon. Very strong voices from the era. Recommend that maybe you pick up these guys from Bookworks. By the way, this whole book, I figured out just recently, takes place over the course of a decade, just a decade from around the time I was 17 to the time I was about around 27. Let me read a little bit here about heading off toward the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. The campaign came through in a series of buses from starting over in L.A. in our case, and other buses coming from San Francisco going across through Denver, buses and even mule trains coming up from the south toward Washington, D.C. Real mule trains, hauled by mules along the roads. It was quite a time. I'm sure there were more buses from Seattle and Portland, and they all converged at Washington. Well, the one who came through here, they came through and we had a big gathering there at what used to be the Civic Auditorium, which doesn't exist anymore. It was west of the freeway, north of Lomas Boulevard, and had a big gathering there. And Reyes Tijerina was the master of ceremonies, and he was quite a speaker. He was basically a preacher. He had that preacher voice. He could tell a story, get the crowd on their feet. And as a special incentive, Marlon Brando flew in for this event, and he was coming. And so you've got Reyes keeping the crowd going. Oh, here comes Brando! And there was a guy on the stage at the podium who had to suddenly pick up his notes when the crowd started ignoring him. Brando he had to skitter off the stage. So Brando comes in and gives a really roaring speech, a really wonderful speech about the problems of America, and how, especially what he was mostly concerned about was the Native Americans at the time. That was a major focus of his efforts. And so he gets done with his talk and then starts to leave. And then Reyes Tijerina had a few words of praise for this remarkable man. And Brando returned to a place by the podium next to Tijerina. The crowd roared at Tijerina's remarks, and Brando smiled and waved. It was time to go. Then Tijerina went on to further extol the virtues of one so selfless and willing to share his good fortune and his abilities with the many who were far less fortunate. More applause. Brando waved again and tried to leave, but Reyes was just hitting a stride. And he carried on for several more minutes as Brando shuffled his feet nervously. His aides were pointing at their watches and he nodded in agreement. Brando reached another crescendo. There was more applause. Reyes reached another crescendo. There was more applause. Brando stepped to this microphone and said a few more words of heartfelt thanks and encouragement to the crowd. Then he shook Reyes' hand once more, waved to the applauding crowd, and headed for the side door, gracefully acknowledging all the people who lined his path while several aides led the way. He glanced at me and smiled as he hurried past, and I smiled back. I had become more than just an observer in this powerful moment, and I was happy and proud to be there with everyone else in the place. I want to say I skipped over part of it here. The reason I was there was that a girlfriend named Janet at the time was going through journalism school, and it was part of it was an assignment of her and this other fellow to go cover this event. So I was there, just tagged along, didn't realize where this was going to take me. Wonderful places, by the way. Several other speakers tried to fill the enormous gap in the program when Brando left the stage, but he was, as I say, a tough act to follow. After listening briefly to the next speaker, Janet turned and headed for the lobby with Bob and me close behind. We stopped in the lobby and leaned against the white tiled wall as we watched a sea of humanity dressed in varieties of brightly colored clothing. I asked Janice and Bob if they were going to interview anyone, but the idea seemed to make them uncomfortable. Next to us, sitting on the cool vinyl tile floor, were a couple of elderly and overweight Black women fanning themselves with folded newspapers. They were reminding several young children, grandchildren, I assume, who came and went in the crowd like little explorers in a strange new world, returning to home base often for reassurance. I squatted down and leaned back against the wall, and then I asked if they had come in on the buses. Oh, Lordy, yes, they said almost simultaneously. And it was hot, too. All the way from LA across the desert without hardly no stops at all. I never seen the likes of it before. I had nothing out there but sand and cactus. It only took a simple question to get them talking. From then on, my end of the conversation mostly amounted to, I see, and other assurances that I was still listening and hadn't left or fallen asleep or something. Janice and Bob were watching and listening over my shoulder. When we got to El Paso, they continued, the police wouldn't even let us off the buses for about 2 hours. We was all hot and sticky. Them buses are just like big tin cans in the summer. The kids was crying and carrying on like you never seen. Then we came up here across even more desert. How's come you ain't got no trees here? This is the driest place on God's green earth. I never seen nothing like it. They reminded me of my own grandmother on my father's side. They spoke simple, unschooled, and true, like she always had, and with that same middle Southern accent. And like Grandma, these women were both on the hefty side. I could picture them in their kitchen back home, urging another helping of pancakes on the grandkids. And I can imagine the grandkids giggling and struggling to escape their sudden engulfing kisses, like I always did when I was their age. Their voices blended like two sisters who lived together all their lives, and one always picked up the narrative where the other left off. My eyes were drawn from one to the other as the story shifted between them. I nodded my head as I tried to follow their adventures. Regarding the question about why there were no trees here, it was more of a statement than a question, and they weren't really interested in the rain shadow effect and a scientific explanation, etc. No, they never even paused for an answer, of course. So a slender young man walked up to check on the two grandmothers, and I stood up to make room. He was about my height and build, and I guessed he was within a year or two of my age, with beautiful olive colored skin and an engaging smile. He'd also gotten on the bus in LA and had taken these two elderly women under his care, helping them on and off the bus, taking them to their hotel room, making sure they had cold drinking water. They treated him very affectionately, just like another of their many grandsons. We began to talk, he and I, in that language of the socially committed segment of our generation, and I sensed that we shared many interests. We talked about the issues facing the poor of America, about where the bus caravan was headed next, about what they'd do when they arrived in Washington, and we talked about the movement, the idealistic force that seemed to bind our generation in a common purpose in what would be our defining moment. Then he asked, why don't you come with us? He saw my hesitation and he went on before I could think of anything to reply. You could just get on the bus in the morning and come along. We need people to show their support and commitment and to help out with the cause. Just being there is important. I was stunned at the invitation. It sounded like a wonderful idea. Just get a change of clothing together and get on the bus in the morning, be a part of some interesting and important things that were going on. Do something personally to help force the changes we all knew the nation needed in order to make things right and fair for everyone. See the country from a completely different perspective. I would have been off on an adventure and I'd actually be doing some good at the same time. At the moment, I was just working for a living and I wasn't really getting anywhere in particular. And this relationship with Janice sure wasn't going anywhere either. My emotional batteries were low and I could use a good dose of adventure and idealism. But there was a problem. There's always a problem with any plan as simple as this. The problem was I had a job. I needed that job to pay the rent on my shabby apartment and to buy food. Wouldn't be any big deal to just quit the job. I could get another construction job when I returned, and I needed to collect a couple more paychecks to pay the rent a month ahead and to have a little traveling money. I needed to just stay here just a little bit longer to make it all work. He saw my hesitation. Come on, he offered again. We're leaving in the morning. We have room. Just get on the bus and come with us. We need everybody to help out with us if we're going to make it happen. He had me there. I paused briefly and took a breath. Just how badly did I really want to change things anyway? Or was it too much trouble to get involved? To make it was it inconvenient to make Martin Luther King's vision a reality now that he was gone. Tell you what, I finally said, I can't leave tomorrow. There was this disappointment on his face. I was starting to look like just another white liberal who wouldn't take a stand. As Saul Alinsky, the fiery Chicago organizer, would say, a liberal is a guy who leaves the room when an argument turns into a fight. Clearly, he was right. But I'll see you there. I continued with a serious and steady gaze. I'll see you there. I'll get to Washington and I'll see you there. He looked me in the eye, then he smiled and shook my hand. My name's Eric, he said. I'll see you in Washington. And a few weeks later, I was standing out in Tijeras Canyon, flagging down a ride. And I had a bedroll and a backpack and about $10 in my pocket. But let's just go for it. It was fabulous. Got a lot of really interesting rides along the way. And never forget it. Sleeping rough out there in the wilds, sleeping in fields and such. Funny thing, when I came back out after Washington, D.C., I tell you the whole story in here. When I came back, this is not in the book, when I came back through Washington, D.C. to visit relatives in Louisville, Kentucky, I stopped at my grandmother's place, my grandparents' place, the grandmother I mentioned, the old black ladies reminded me of. And she swore that after I left, they never had ants in the house before, but they had ants after I left. I guess they caught a ride from a field somewhere along the way. And anyway, she had ants after I left. So let me read a bit of a passage into Mexico, and then we can take some questions if you'd like, whatever you'd like to do. This is after I get off the bus, and we get down to Juarez, and I'm sitting there on the curb, waiting for my bus to leave for Chihuahua, and the guy Mark who drove me down there, he and I are having a conversation. His wife Linda had already gotten on her bus and was headed to Mexico City to do some research. I was headed completely different direction. So this is the next morning in Chihuahua. The morning sun burned fine and hard through a dusty haze hanging over the ancient stone streets of Chihuahua. I stopped for a long, unhurried breakfast of huevos revueltos con tocino y café and practiced my minimal Spanish by picking slowly through the morning paper with a Spanish-English dictionary by my elbow. A feature story with pictures documented the presence of hippies right here in the capital city of the state of Chihuahua. I smiled at the phonetic Spanish spelling for hippies. It's spelled J-I-P-I-S, hippies, J-I-P-I-S in Spanish. The photos clearly showed these people described as greñudos, unkempt, and melenudos, disheveled. walking the streets a largo, at large. The pictures were taken several days earlier, and since I had arrived yesterday on the bus from Juarez, they didn't show me wandering these dusty streets. The good people of the quiet provincial city of Chihuahua had enough to worry about without the threat of another gringo hippie wandering their city at large. I finished my breakfast and stepped outside into a blinding mid-morning mid-Mexican sun. It was going to be another hot, dry June day, and already a dusty mist of dirt and diesel fumes hung upon the air like a soiled and faded linen curtain. Each passing truck or bus painted another dusty layer across the hazy horizon. I turned and walked toward the cathedral. The huge and ancient front door stood ajar, and inside a reservoir of cool air hung silent and lofty space, giving relief from the gathering heat of the day. On this weekday, as on any other day, the abuelitos were nailing and praying for divine assistance, for small measures of relief from the wretched lives of poverty. Decades of struggle were written in their leathery faces. I sat quietly in an old wooden pew and studied the handworked stone of the walls, the massive columns, and the high distant ceiling. Small particles of dust hung silently in shafts of sunlight streaming down from clerestory windows high overhead, washing a strip of floor and wall in a golden light. A murmur of shuffling feet and muffled prayer filled the space. It was a quiet time to sit upon ancient wooden pews for a moment of rest, peace, and reflection before moving on. I left the cathedral and walked several more blocks down a narrow, shady street toward the Pancho Villa Museum. Thick walls of old adobe homes crowded the hewn stone sidewalks on each side of the street. A front door opened to a private courtyard filled with flowers. Women were cleaning and doing laundry. A bird cage hung from a beam under a long portal with a pair of brilliant yellow canaries happily greeting the morning. I passed the bar in Pala at a corner just before the museum, and I thought how good a cold beer would taste. But it was still early in the day, and a beer could wait until later. The museum was privately run by Luz Corral, one of the ex-wives of Pancho Villa. As I understood it, she was the last of about 14 of them. She had managed to collect a number of paintings, photos, guns, clothing, and other Pancho Villa memorabilia through the years after his death. And now she was making a modest living, showing them off in her home, mostly to American tourist types like myself. Displays were arranged under a courtyard portal and even included the car that carried Viet when he was finally ambushed and killed in Parral, a town in the hills southwest of the city of Chihuahua. Jagged holes were visible along the side of the car where bullets had sliced through the old hulk and now rusting from years of neglect. On a wall behind the car, hung a picture of Senora Villa posing with the car, posing with the car, her hands on the bullet-riddled door, a broad smile upon her face. I had been slowly following a chubby, middle-aged Anglo couple through the displays and had successfully avoided contact with them as they tried to make sense of the accumulation around them. They wore that classic 1960s American tourist costume that was a caricature of the era. He sported blue madras shorts, a band-lawn shirt that failed to cover his large belly, and a small straw hat with a loudly colored cloth band. An expensive camera hung around his neck. His wife wore a plaid shirt and white stretch pants that struggled to contain her enormous rear. A pair of sunglasses with pointy corners hung at her neck from a beaded necklace. They were both having a lot of trouble with the display labels, which were all in Spanish, and I stayed just far enough away to be of no help to them. I had not come here to the heart of northern Mexico to spend time with gringos. I had hoped to leave the US far behind and seriously work on my Spanish. And after the divorce, I really needed the space to think, to look at my life in a different way. Maybe I should even live in Mexico. The thought crowded its way into my cluttered mind. Growing up in the southwestern US, the idea of living in Mexico always had a certain allure. As teenagers, my friend and I spoke often of heading for the border to escape trouble. Well, what we would really do down there, actually, when we arrived, we had no idea. Like most teenage schemes, it was poorly thought out, kind of like joining the Marines to get away from the oppression of living at home with your parents. As I watched the heavy-set American tourist couple struggling through the museum displays, when I'm describing this heavy-set American couple, I'm, of course, a skinny young guy at the time. I'm not a skinny young guy so much anymore. I was sure that politically speaking, we were on polar opposites. I had lived an alternative lifestyle so far. I had written some bad poetry. I had lived in a commune. I had smoked my share of dope. They looked like a pair of Nixon Republicans. I couldn't imagine anything good could possibly come out of our relationship, our acquaintanceship. Still, I grudgingly respected whatever curiosity had brought them to this small museum in a back street of the northern Mexican town of Chihuahua. There weren't a lot of tourist attractions here, and they may not have been aware of that before they arrived. On the other hand, after this one trip, they probably have enough stories collected to amaze their friends for years to come. We finished our tour of the dusty remains of the lives of Francisco Pancho Villa, and moved toward the exit. We passed Senora Villa seated in a rocking chair, and she began to tell us about her life and the exploits of her infamous husband. She began her monologue slowly in a dead, weary voice of heavily accented English with an occasional Spanish word thrown in. I could only imagine how many times she had given this talk to groups of tourists like us. As she progressed with her tale, she began talking faster, and Spanish soon replaced the English entirely. The Republican couple leaned forward, trying to hear and decipher the story as she moved at an increasing pace. Then she stopped and stuck out her hand, palm up. She'd finished the story. It was time to pay up and move on. The Republican guy and I each fumbled with our wallets, and soon we all found ourselves standing on the sidewalk out front. The Republicans mumbling to each other, me laughing softly to myself at the whole ridiculous scene. We may have had little in common north of the border, but in Mexico, we were all equal opportunity suckers. I realized that now I really was thirsty, and I walked back down that hot, dusty street toward the Bar Impala, slowly shaking my head and smiling wryly. So that gets us into the beginning of the trip into Mexico. And I didn't want to overread, but one of the things that brought me down there was this is one that Amanda probably can't get for you at Bookworks. Mexico on $5 and $10 a day, but I still have it around. It traveled with me down there into Mexico. And when I was in the Marines, did I show you these couple of books I ended up reading? And once again, we go over to Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. Good poets. I'll just stop right there. See if people have any questions, any comments, whatever.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing your stories, Pery, and your book recommendations.